Welcome back to Citizen One, exploring our urban future. I'm Douglas Stewart McDaniel. And today, I want to tell you a little bit about my neighborhood here in Barcelona. Not the Barcelona of postcards, not Antoni Gaudi's spires of La Sagrada Familia dissolving into the sky, or the wider geometry of the Eixample, or the Gothic quarter all dressed up for tourists. Those places are real and they matter, but they are not where cities do a lot of the actual work. The place I want to talk about is El Raval, specifically a district of about 1 square kilometer that sits just west of the Rambla and runs from Plaça de Catalunya down toward the port. With a population of 48 to 50,000 people, that density is extremely high by European standards and on par with the density of places like Dhaka. Denser than Manhattan and roughly double Paris city average. El Raval is one of the 4 neighborhoods of the larger district of Ciutat Vella, or the Old City. And here's some interesting numbers. It's more than 55% foreign-born, with many from Pakistan, Bangladesh, the Philippines, Morocco, India, Italy, Colombia, Uruguay, Peru, and Honduras. In the early 20th century, it was called Barrio Chino, or Chinatown. Today, it's sometimes informally called Little Pakistan because of the concentration along Carré de l'Hospital and surrounding streets. Religiously and culturally, you'll find multiple mosques, South Asian groceries and electronic shops, Filipino Catholic networks, North African cafes, long-time and elderly Catalan and Spanish residents, and a heavily transient EU creative class and university population, along with growing short-term rental tourist turnover pressure. El Raval is not just diverse, it's vertically layered. On 5 floors in one building, you may have an elderly Catalan widow, a Pakistani shopkeeper family, students and digital nomads, undocumented laborers, short-term Airbnbs, and that stacking creates a rich and wonderful intensity. The district is anchored by a medieval hospital, a market that has been feeding the city since the 13th century, and an opera house that was bombed or burned 3 times and was rebuilt on the same address each time. Within that corridor, you can trace almost everything a city is actually for. How it absorbs labor, manages illness, performs culture, feeds its people, and quietly catches whoever falls. I live here on Carré de les Cabres, the street of the goats, which is either charming or accurate depending on my mood. These next 3 episodes in the Citizen One podcast are going to stay close to home here in Barcelona and in El Raval, walking distance, a few blocks in each direction with some side trips of a couple of kilometers. That's a deliberate constraint because I've come to believe that cities reveal themselves most clearly at close range, around obscure addresses and modest street corners, not at their monuments. The monuments tell you what a city wants you to think about it. The street corners tell you how it actually functions. And this first episode traces the history of this corridor, the market, the hospital, the opera house, and what it means that they ended up in the same few blocks. The second follows what happens when you disturb the ground 2 blocks from my apartment, and the city's entire biography starts surfacing. Medieval ships, Roman battlefields, anarchist bunkers, hospital cemeteries. And then the third contracts to the most intimate scale of all, the kitchen and the market, and what it means when a city provisions its people well enough that cooking stops being an act of self-sabotage. 3 episodes, 1 neighborhood, close range. What connects them is a single question. What does it look like when urban systems actually work? Not when they're celebrated or curated or marketed to visitors as live, work, play, but when they're simply functioning quietly in the background of daily life, doing the job people who live inside them need done. Now, let me start by saying Barcelona is not a perfect city. No city is, but it is a legible one. It has layers it doesn't hide, and infrastructure it hasn't aestheticized beyond recognition. It manages its history without either freezing it behind glass or bulldozing it for the next project. It tends to nurture its people at human scale and has, over centuries, developed a particular competence at absorbing pressure. Demographic, cultural, economic, and continuing forward without pretending the pressure was never there. That urban competence is what this miniseries is about. We're not here today for the landmarks. We're here to read how it functions. So let's get started. I want to talk about how El Raval operates inside as the city's zone of pressure. Because I've inhabited a lot of cities around the world, and I've learned something the hard way. Cities rarely reveal themselves at those famous monuments. They reveal themselves around obscure addresses in modest street corners. I live here in Barcelona on Carrer de les Cabres in El Raval, a few steps off La Rambla, near the seam of where La Rambla de San Josep transitions into La Rambla del Capuchin. On a map, it doesn't look like much of a distinction from the Gothic quarter on the other side of La Rambla. But if you look at how cities actually work, how labor, culture, illness, ambition, performance, and survival overlap, this is one of those places where, yes, everything compresses. Now, this is not a definitive portrait of El Raval or a comprehensive history, but it's a reading of one corridor through the passage of time, a field study in urban literacy. And none of it erases what El Raval also is: a culturally rich lived neighborhood with families, loyalties, and daily routines that exist along everything I'm about to describe. Sometimes El Raval gets pretty scruffy reputation, and that, I think, is really oversimplifying a complex district. The word Raval derives from the Arabic rabad, used across Al-Andalus and the medieval Iberian South to denote urbanized suburbs beyond a city's walls. These were zones of labor, logistics, care, and circulation, often markets and workshops, travelers, hospitals, verterias, and people whose presence was necessary but not always convenient. That word alone matters because it reminds us of something easy to forget. Barcelona absorbed Arabic administrative language without ever being governed under Muslim rule. Unlike cities like Valencia or Zativa, which fell under Islamic governance for centuries, Barcelona remained north of the frontier. Muslim armies reached the region briefly in the early 8th century, but the Carolingians reclaimed the city in 801 and folded it into the Marsa Hispanica, a militarized buffer zone between worlds. And that frontier status shaped everything. Barcelona became a fortified city obsessed with walls and thresholds. What didn't fit inside them, functionally, socially, or morally, was pushed outward. The land west of the medieval core became exactly what Rabat describes: a necessary exterior. That same etymology runs through La Rambla itself. That name comes from the Arabic Ramla, a sandy riverbed, or wadi, a seasonal watercourse. Before it was a promenade as it is today, La Rambla was a drainage channel, carrying floodwater from the Colserola Mountains toward the sea. A soft boundary where water moved, waste flowed, and the city managed what it could not contain. Like Raval, the word survived because the function it described never stopped being needed. El Raval began as farmland supplying the city with food. By the Middle Ages, it had accumulated the institutions cities prefer not to keep too close: hospitals, convents, charitable houses, hostels, slaughterhouses, warehouses. The Hospital de la Santa Cruz, founded in the early 15th century, anchored this role physically and symbolically. Care, illness, and death belonged here, not as failure, but as deliberate placement. This was not marginal land in the economic sense. It was central infrastructure, held at arm's length. But as Barcelona grew, density increased rather than spreading outward. By the 18th and 19th centuries, El Raval had become one of the most crowded urban districts in Europe. Industrialization didn't invent the neighborhood's role, it intensified it. Workshops replaced gardens, tenements replaced hostels, labor stacked vertically because proximity mattered more than comfort. But make no mistake, El Raval was never a failure. It was an early form of urban planning, honest enough to say what it was doing. Modern urban language tends to moralize neighborhoods like this. It describes them as problems to be solved, reputations to be corrected, zones to be cleaned up. That framing misses the point. El Raval was never an aberration in Barcelona's development. It was the city's cultural and economic release valve, the place where pressure went so the rest of the city could function as if there were none. Cities survived by externalizing pressure into places designed to absorb it. El Raval did that work for centuries. It housed the arriving, the laboring, the sick, the rehearsing, the failing, and occasionally the ascendant. And we'll get to that. Once you see El Raval as a system rather than a stigma, the map changes. The neighborhood stops being abstract and starts becoming spatial. You can trace its logic block by block. And if you follow where food enters, where illness concentrates, labor gathers, and where culture performs, you end up in one very specific corridor. So I want to talk about this axis between the Liceo, the Opera House, the old hospital, and the axis around the Boqueria. Because cities don't operate evenly, they operate along such corridors. My street, Calle de las Cabres, which literally cuts through the Boqueria, is one of those tiny little pedestrian corridors. It's no grand axis in the Haussmannian sense. It's a functional one, tight little knot where food, illness, labor, and performance have intersected for centuries. And just 20 meters from my door sits the famous Mercat de la Boqueria, whose origins as an open-air meat market date to at least the early 13th century. Long before it was roofed or aestheticized, this was where livestock entered the city and food was processed at scale. Markets like this demand proximity to labor, transport routes, and waste disposal. They generate noise, smell, and early morning movement, activities cities historically push to the edges of acceptability. On the opposite corner of my street lies Carré de l'Hospital, named for the Hospital de la Santa Cruz. For centuries, it was Barcelona's primary site for treating the sick, injured, poor, and displaced. Today, its former wards house the Biblioteca de Catalunya, a site once dedicated to bodily care, now responsible for the city's memory. The hospital's admissions registers list laborers, porters, market workers, sailors, and actors, and dancers, and writers, and domestic servants, and architects, most giving addresses in the surrounding streets. Hospitals are magnets, not just for patients, but for those surrounding lodging houses and tavernas and informal care networks and families living one injury away from collapse. Then there is the Gran Teatro del Liceo, opened 3 blocks down on the Raval side of La Rambla in 1847. Its placement was not cultural happenstance. The Gothic quarter was already getting saturated, and opera required what neither it nor the El Born district nearby could offer at scale: space, flexible parcels, late hours, workshops, rehearsal rooms, and a dense labor pool willing to live irregular and chaotic lives. El Raval already operated on that chaotic logic because the Liceo was volatile. Crowds, politics, fire risk, constant backstage labor. It burned almost completely in 1861, was rebuilt, then burned again in 1994. And a century before, in 1893, an anarchist bomb killed 20 audience members during the second act of Guillaume Tell, an opera, not incidentally, about rebellion against authority. The building survived each time. The address never changed. And that persistence tells you everything. The Liceo was placed here because this corridor could absorb spectacle and risk without destabilizing the city's symbolic core. Opera did not civilize this district. The district made opera possible. Map these 3 institutions together: the market, the hospital, and the opera, and you see a maximum throughput zone for food, care, culture, and labor. You could wake before dawn to work at the market, be carried to the hospital when you're injured, rehearse near the Liceo, and walk home after midnight, all without leaving a few blocks. That's not chaos, that's logistics. This is why the area generated so much documentation: police reports, hospital admissions, tax rolls, newspapers. When activity concentrates, paperwork follows. El Raval became legible to the state precisely because it was so indispensable. Now, this is not the romantic heart of Barcelona, but it is an important circulatory system. And living here means living inside the flow rather than observing it from a distance. Now, I want to jump to some of the people who passed through here. And this is not a who's who, because streets like these don't collect famous people after success. They collect people before those outcomes are decided. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the streets radiating off La Rambla, Carré de l'Hospital, Carré Nu de la Rambla, Carré de Joaquín Costa, or Carré de Saint Pau, formed a dense lattice of those lodging houses, rented rooms, workshops, cafes, and informal studios. And they weren't necessarily permanent addresses for people with options or money. They were temporary footholds for lives still in motion. Municipal padron records from this period show high turnover, residents staying for months or a few years rather than decades. Occupations repeat more reliably than names. Birthplaces range widely, reflecting internal migration from rural Catalonia, Valencia, Aragon, and later southern Spain. Stability in the modern sense was rare. Proximity was everything. And this is the environment Pablo Picasso entered when he arrived in Barcelona at the turn of the 20th century. His best documented residents were elsewhere, but his daily working geography early on extended directly into this corridor. Early, cheap studios, cafes, and lodgings clustered around Carre de l'Hospital, dense with artist workshops and informal exhibition spaces. This ecosystem likely fed what became his blue period, an artistic phase shaped less by inspiration than by proximity to poverty, illness, and transient lives. But make no mistake, Picasso was not exceptional. He was typical. This lower Rambla edge was a magnet, not because it was romantic, but because it was workable. Artists and performers came here before they had outcomes, when they needed cheap rooms, late hours, flexible arrangements, and a network that didn't ask too many questions. If the Eixample was promising stability and clean geometry, this corridor offered something more useful: access to audiences, to labor, to cafes, to rehearsal spaces, to the city's raw material. Just a short walk down Carre Nu de la Rambla stands Palau Güell, designed by Gaudí and completed in 1888. Commissioned by the industrialist Eusebi Güell, it was placed deliberately at the edge of Raval rather than in the orderly Eixample, like Casa Batlle, for example. Güell was wealthy enough to withdraw into cleaner streets. He chose proximity instead, placing elite patronage inside the city's densest circulation zone, steps from the Liceo, the market, and the labor that sustained both. And I doubt this was charity or eccentricity. It was an acknowledgement that culture and risk don't thrive at a distance from each other. Within a few blocks, industrial wealth being translated into architectural experimentation, high culture staged nightly at the opera, artists living cheaply within walking distance of rehearsal rooms, and an invisible layer of labor sustaining the entire system from below. These were not separate worlds arranged neatly across the city. They were being stacked tightly together, each dependent on the others, sharing the same streets and the same constraints. Most residents here left behind little celebrated work. They appear briefly in the archive, a census line, a hospital ledger, rental records, and then disappear. But every so often, the pressure in a place like this concentrates so intensely that the city fixates on a single figure and lets her stand in for everything it doesn't want to examine structurally. And El Raval had one of those figures, because every neighborhood that sits long enough at the intersection of fear and necessity eventually produces figures who become shorthand for the city's anxieties. In El Raval, one of these figures was Enriqueta Martí, a woman history remembers as La Vampira del Raval. The nickname stuck because it was useful. It allowed the city to condense anxiety, poverty, child mortality, gender transgression, and class guilt into a single monster. The reality is more unsettling and more urban. Enriqueta Martí lived and operated within the same tight corridor around Carre de Joaquín Costa and Carre de l'Hospital, dense with those boarding houses, informal labor, sex work, childcare arrangements, and women surviving outside formal employment structures. It was tough. These streets were also under heavy surveillance because proximity to markets, hospitals, and vice economies attracts institutional attention long before it attracts understanding or compassion. She was arrested in 1912 after her neighbors reported suspicious activity involving children. Police searches uncovered disturbing material. The press transformed this quickly into a narrative of ritual murder, child trafficking, and occult practices. Newspapers amplified her story with enthusiasm. The public responded with horror and relief. The monster had been captured. But here's the part that matters for understanding El Raval. Much of what Martí was accused of was never proven in court. She died in custody in 1913, before trial, reportedly beaten by other inmates. So what survives is not her verdict, but an archive of police reports, hospital records, sensationalist journalism, and a mythology that grew precisely because the city needed a container for something it was refusing to face directly. Here's the fact. Early 20th century Barcelona had staggering child mortality. Informal adoptions, child labor, wet nursing, and exploitation existed in gray zones created by poverty and migration. Women without husbands or institutional protection survived through combinations of caregiving, sex work, begging, and informal medicine. Some crossed lines. Many were blamed, though, for systems they did not create. Enriqueta Martí became infamous not simply because of what she may have done, but because she was visible. El Raval's density ensured visibility. Hospitals generating records, police patrolling aggressively, and journalists mining the neighborhood for stories confirming those middle class fears about that district west of La Rambla. Same surveillance that makes this area legible to historians also made it vulnerable to moral panic. Calling Enriqueta Martí a vampire solves several problems at once. It turned structural urban failure into individual evil. It transformed class anxiety into Gothic theater and reassured respectable Barcelona that the danger had a face and that it didn't look like the city itself. But from an urbanist perspective, Martí is not an anomaly. She's an artifact, produced at the intersection of extreme density, informal economies, gendered survival, aggressive surveillance, and a press eager to simplify complexity. Remove any one of those factors, and her story collapses. And maybe that's why she still haunts El Raval, not because she was unique, but because she forced a question cities rarely ask honestly. What kinds of lives do we make inevitable, and who do we blame when they become unbearable? El Raval didn't create a monster. It does expose systemic failure. So the city converts structural strain into individual evil, then preserves the story because it was easier to remember than take responsibility. That asymmetry still shapes how the area is remembered, but it also points towards something else. A moment when the mythology worked in reverse, when the city's most celebrated figure passed through the same infrastructure it reserved for everyone else, and nobody recognized him. It was June of 1926 when Barcelona failed to recognize one of its most celebrated figures. It was Antoni Gaudí himself, by then the most famous architect in the city, the mind behind buildings that would define Barcelona's global identity, was struck by a tram while crossing the Gran Via. He was 73 years old. He was walking alone, dressed plainly, and carried no identification. So witnesses assumed he was a beggar. Passers-by hesitated, some ignored him entirely. A policeman eventually intervened and had him transported to a hospital. Here is the detail that matters. He was taken to the Hospital de la Santa Cruz, the same medieval institution that had served those laborers, migrants, the poor, and the injured of El Raval for centuries. Gaudí was admitted as an unidentified man, not as Barcelona's great architect, not as the designer of Palau Güell or Casa Batlló, just blocks away, not as the builder of La Sagrada Familia, the new cathedral rising above the city. Just another guy, just another body. He remained there 3 days before friends and colleagues identified him. By then, it was too late. He died on June 10th, 1926, in the hospital that quietly absorbs the city's invisible lives for generations. This is a trivia. It's a precise illustration of how cities often work. In moments of crisis, identity collapses into physical appearance. Systems respond not to legacy, but to legibility. Antoni Gaudí, stripped of every marker of class and recognition, passed instantly into the same institutional channel as dock workers and market laborers. The same hospital, the same beds, the same bureaucratic logic. And now for decades, critics have framed El Raval as a place of disorder or moral failure. A lot of the realtors here in Barcelona will make TikToks pointing at it's not a neighborhood you want to live. But when the city's most celebrated architect is reduced to anonymity, this is the neighborhood in which he landed, not a private clinic or a bourgeois enclave. In the city's oldest public hospital, embedded in the very district it spent so long surveilling and disavowing. Gaudí's death doesn't reveal an irony, it reveals a consistency. El Raval was never the city's perimeter or outside, it was its safety net. When systems fail, when identities blur, when lives fall suddenly out of narrative, cities rely on places like El Raval to catch the consequences. The city builds monuments elsewhere to tell cleaner stories, but the record remains. Gaudí entered the archive here the same way thousands of others do, through injury, anonymity, and care administered without ceremony. Cities remember their icons, they depend on their margins, and when the distinction collapses, the margins often tell the truer story. So living in El Raval today doesn't feel like I'm inhabiting either a ruin or a revival. It feels like I'm inhabiting an urban system that never stopped running. From my balcony, the same circulation that has defined this area for centuries continues. Those deliveries before dawn, the market workers moving with purpose, nightlife dissolving into morning routines, Catalan and Spanish lovers shouting at each other for 20 minutes and then loving each other passionately. Tourists drifting through without understanding what the hell they're passing through. Residents who know exactly where they are and why. The aesthetics haven't changed. The function hasn't. This is still a place where proximity matters more than polish, where people live close to work because time is a constraint, where anonymity remains a form of insulation, where the city's cultural performance, now globalized and monetized, rests on labor that stays largely invisible. What's different now is not the role of the neighborhood, but the language used to describe it. Urban renewal frames places like this as problems to be solved. Gentrification reframes them as authentic once the risk has been partially mitigated. But both of those narratives miss the point. El Raval is not in some transitional phase on the way to something better. It's a permanent urban function. The same forces that once routed farmers and porters and performers in the sick through these streets now route service workers, migrants, artists, and gig labor of a global digital economy. The names change, the paperwork changes, but the surveillance continues, and the logic still holds. Living here sharpens my perception about what a city is. Noise stops reading as disorder and starts reading as signal. Density stops feeling like congestion and starts feeling like compression. Turnover stops suggesting instability and starts suggesting improved circulation. Cities love to celebrate their monuments and sanitize the margins, but when something breaks, when someone falls, when identity collapses and systems overload, it's places like El Raval that absorb the shock. That was true when the city failed to recognize Antoni Gaudí. It was true when Enriqueta Martí became the container for collective urban fear. It is still true now in quieter, more bureaucratic ways. El Raval is not Barcelona's shadow district. It is one of its load-bearing structures. Urbanism fails when it treats neighborhoods like this as anomalies. One day, I might pull every record tied to this address down at the Biblioteca de Catalunya, if I can, and reconstruct the households, the trades, the injuries, the arrivals, and the departures. But I don't need that data yet to understand what this place has always been doing. The city is already telling all of their stories. You just have to live close enough to listen to them. And that's the first episode in a series of 3 about my close love and affection for this particular district of Barcelona. I'm Douglas Stewart McDaniel, and this is Citizen One, exploring our urban future. Thanks for joining.